Let me be honest with you about something. I've been sitting on this for a few days now because I wanted to make sure I had it right before I said it out loud. And what I've landed on is this. What the NFL just did to Brandon Sorsby isn't a close call. It isn't one of those situations where reasonable people can look at the same set of facts and come away with different conclusions. This is the league taking a written agreement, one that both sides signed, and quietly deciding that the words in that agreement don't actually mean what they say. And I think that matters enough to talk about seriously, so that's what we're going to do. Here's where we start. Sorsby files for the supplemental draft. His legal team, and we're not talking about some small-time operation here. We're talking about Jeffrey Kessler, a man who has spent decades fighting the most powerful sports institutions in the country and winning, reads the CBA language carefully, and concludes that Sorsby qualifies. The eligibility standard isn't buried in some obscure clause. It's actually pretty clear. If you were draft eligible in April, and something happened after that point which materially changed your circumstances, you have a case for the supplemental draft. That's the framework. That's what the agreement says. Kessler and his team went through the process exactly as instructed. One-page application. When they followed up to ask if anything additional was needed, the league gave them no indication that it was, and then the rejection came anyway. But here's the part I can't let go of. The NFL didn't just say no, they constructed a reason. They said they didn't have enough time to investigate the gambling allegations, that Sorsby hadn't demonstrated sufficient accountability. And when you first hear that language, it sounds measured. It sounds like the league is being appropriately cautious about a serious situation. But then you go back and you look at what the CBA actually requires of a supplemental draft applicant, and you realize something that stops you cold. None of that language is in there. There is no accountability standard. There is no investigation prerequisite. The league invented criteria from thin air and then used those invented criteria to close the door on a player whose application was, on its face, legitimate. That's not a judgment call. That's not a gray area. That's the NFL making up the rules as it goes and dressing it up in procedural language. And I want to stay with that for a moment because I think there's a version of this story where we all just absorb it and move on. We've seen the league operate with this kind of unilateral authority enough times that there's almost a numbness to it. But this particular situation deserves more sustained attention because the man challenging it isn't going away quietly. Kessler already took the NCAA to court on Sorsby's behalf and came out the other side with a victory. He knows exactly what he's looking at here, and his presence in this fight tells you something important about how serious the legal argument actually is. Now I want to bring up a name that I think is the most important comparison available in this entire conversation: Josh Gordon. I keep coming back to Gordon because his case isn't just similar to Sorsby's. It's essentially the test case for how the supplemental draft is supposed to function when a player comes in carrying significant baggage. Multiple failed drug tests, removed from his program entirely before he ever set foot in the league. A track record of violations that was documented, not alleged, not under investigation, documented and repeated. And when Gordon applied for the supplemental draft, the NFL ran the process. No delays, no announcement about needing time to investigate, no requirement that he express sufficient remorse before the application would even be considered. The league moved forward. Cleveland took him in the second round, and teams got to make their own assessment of the talent versus the risk. That was the process working as designed. So I have to ask the question directly, why is Sorsby getting a completely different version of the rulebook? Because if your answer is that gambling on your own team feels morally worse to the league than repeatedly failing drug tests, then what you're describing is a preference. And preferences are not rules. Preferences don't override written agreements. What the league did here wasn't apply a principle. It manufactured one after the fact and applied it retroactively to a specific player at a specific moment. That's a different thing entirely, and it's a worse thing. Let me be clear about something before I go further. I'm not standing here telling you that the gambling allegations against Sorsby don't matter. They do. Wagering on your own team's games, even as a minor, is serious. I'm not minimizing that. What I'm saying is that the appropriate response to a serious situation is to address it within a process that already exists, not to invent new eligibility requirements on the spot and apply them selectively. If the league needed time to investigate before making a determination, fine. Build that into the process. Make that a stated condition. But you cannot reject an application on the basis of standards you created after the application was submitted and then present that rejection as principled. What you've actually done in that scenario is tell every player who comes behind Sorsby that the written language in the CBA is decorative, that what's on paper matters only when the league finds it convenient, and that when they don't, they'll reach for whatever language feels appropriate in the moment. And this isn't the first time we've watched this play out. When the federal arbitrator handed down a 6 6-game suspension for Deshaun Watson, the NFL didn't accept that result. They pushed for something harsher because the official outcome didn't produce the message they wanted to send. When Colin Kaepernick exercised a legal right to protest, he never played another NFL snap. When Brian Flores filed a lawsuit alleging systemic discrimination in the hiring process, he spent years unable to get a head coaching interview. The pattern isn't subtle. The league values its own authority above almost everything else, and players who challenge that authority through legitimate legal channels are made to feel the weight of that preference in very concrete ways. So when people warn that Sorsby pursuing litigation could make teams reluctant to sign him, I understand why they say it. But what that advice is really asking is for a player to absorb an unjust outcome silently in order to protect his employment prospects. That's a brutal thing to ask, and it rewards exactly the behavior that created the problem in the first place. There are paths forward here. Litigation continues and forces the supplemental draft issue either now or as a legal precedent that reshapes the process for the next generation of players. Sorsby pursues the undrafted free agent route and earns his way onto a roster without the draft designation. Or he waits until 2027, re-enters the process, and lets this chapter recede into background noise rather than becoming the defining narrative of how his career began. None of those options is clean, but the involvement of Kessler signals pretty clearly which direction Sorsby's camp is leaning. And if the Players Association steps alongside that effort and frames this as a CBA compliance issue rather than an individual eligibility dispute, the scope of this fight changes dramatically. It becomes a question about whether the NFL is institutionally capable of honoring agreements it signs when honoring them produces results it doesn't like. That's a conversation the league should be very uncomfortable having. Now I want to shift to something that's been developing inside Cleveland itself, because there's a separate story building inside the Browns organization that doesn't show up in press releases or get addressed in any media availability I've seen. And I want to be precise about what I mean, because this isn't about scheme fit or arm talent or any of the conventional evaluation categories. Those conversations are happening and they matter, but they're the surface layer. What I'm focused on is the layer underneath, something quieter and more deliberate, something I've been tracking closely because the more I look at it, the more convinced I become that the actual quarterback competition in Cleveland is only partially being waged on the practice field. The reports coming out of the Browns facility are positioning Deshaun Watson as the likely starter heading into the season. Some of what's circulating suggests he could be given a meaningful runway at the start of camp to prove he can hold the job before any real reconsideration happens. And I want to be careful here, because there's a difference between a media personality receiving information from inside a building and that building officially declaring a starter. Organizations leak things for reasons. Agents leak things for reasons. Players and their representatives leak things for reasons. The information itself may be accurate, but why it's being released at this particular moment and who benefits from the narrative it creates are questions worth sitting with. What I know is that mandatory minicamp told a different story than the one currently dominating the outside coverage. Shedeur Sanders reportedly closed a gap that a lot of people didn't believe he could close this quickly. Real movement, demonstrable growth, the kind of improvement that isn't just about the prettiness of individual throws, but about how a quarterback processes a defense and trusts his own reads inside a live system. And yet the organizational narrative drifting outward still seems to carry a lean toward Watson, even accounting for that growth, which makes me ask a different question than the one everyone else is asking. Not who's performing better, but who's controlling how performance is being described to the outside world. And that's where I have to bring up Jeudy, and I know that name is going to draw some reaction. I've raised this before, and I'll keep raising it as long as the pattern holds, because it keeps holding. Every time a substantive insider detail about this quarterback competition surfaces in outside media, the trail of that information seems to trace back consistently to the same orbit. Now, I understand that someone is going to push back on that and say you can't prove it definitively, and they're right. I can't stamp a name on a recorded conversation, but circumstantial patterns are real things. When enough consistent data points line up in the same direction, you'd be intellectually dishonest to dismiss them simply because you can't produce a smoking gun. Todd Monken has run a tight operation. Closed practices, controlled access, the kind of environment where information doesn't leak accidentally, it gets shared deliberately. So whoever is providing specific competitive details to outside reporters isn't someone who caught a stray comment in a hallway. This is someone who is present, trusted, with real visibility into what's actually happening on the field. And the specificity of some of this reporting isn't vague, impression-based stuff. These are actual competitive reads about how individuals are performing at the position level. That doesn't come from a distance. So, when that level of detail consistently consistently positions Watson as the clear frontrunner, while simultaneously framing Sanders' improvements as insufficient or still lagging behind, the question of where that framing originates starts to matter quite a bit. Not to someone reading a sports column from across the country, but absolutely to Shedeur Sanders, who has to step up and execute in an offense where the most visible receiver may or may not be fully invested in making him look good. And I've actually gone to the tape on this because I wanted to see if what I was hearing matched what I could observe. What I found was a receiver who doesn't give the same effort consistently across different quarterbacks. There are snaps where the extension isn't there, routes where the fight back to the football is noticeably absent, moments where a completion was clearly available if the effort level met the opportunity, and it didn't. And then you look at different situations, different quarterbacks operating behind center, and that hesitation disappears. The urgency returns. The body language shifts entirely. I'm not inventing that. It's on film. Is that proof of deliberate sabotage? I'm not going to call it that definitively, and I mean that. What I will call it is a competitive environment that appears to be operating with an uneven foundation, and a situation where the player most exposed to that unevenness happens to be the same player already fighting an uphill narrative in the broader coverage. And here's the mechanical reality of how quarterback evaluation actually works at this level, because I think it gets overlooked constantly in these conversations. If Sanders throws a football to Jeudy's side of the field and Jeudy runs a sloppy route and doesn't fight back for the ball and the pass falls incomplete, nobody watching from the outside sees the route. They see the quarterback. They mark the incompletion. They start constructing a case about decision-making, about accuracy, about whether this young quarterback is truly ready. And the receiver who gave three-quarter effort on that play gets a clean line in whatever internal tracking the team is running and moves on to the next snap without consequence. That asymmetry is what I don't think we talk about enough when we analyze quarterback competitions. We talk about arm talent endlessly. We talk about pocket presence and processing speed and how quickly a quarterback can go through his progressions. What we don't examine nearly enough is whether the environment around a quarterback is actually pulling in the same direction, and what happens to a young quarterback's evaluation when some of the weapons in that environment are quietly pulling the other way, because the evaluation doesn't capture the context. The evaluation captures the outcome. I want to be clear about something before I close this out. Nothing I've raised here is meant to suggest that Sanders can't win this job. I genuinely think he can, and the spring gave real evidence for that belief. The improvement was substantive. The command inside the system grew visibly. The confidence that comes from actually understanding an offense rather than just learning its surface vocabulary, that kind of foundation doesn't disappear between minicamp and training camp. It builds. And a quarterback who can close a gap that quickly, who can process at that speed, while still learning the NFL level, has something real going for him. But talent and development only carry you so far when the internal politics of a locker room are running a parallel competition that nobody in an official capacity will acknowledge. And what I keep thinking about is what it actually feels like to be in Sanders' position right now. You came in carrying real pressure. You did the spring work. People who were watching closely said, you made genuine strides, closed a gap that wasn't supposed to close this fast. And yet the story being told publicly still reads as if the outcome is mostly settled, as if you're performing from behind, despite the evidence suggesting something more complicated than that. Some of that framing is just the NFL's default assumption that experience beats youth until proven otherwise in live game action. But some of it, I think, is something more intentional than that. And having to navigate that invisible layer on top of everything else, the performance pressure, the scheme learning, the adjustment to the speed of the professional game, is an entirely different kind of challenge that rarely gets acknowledged in the coverage. So here's where we actually are. Two separate stories are developing simultaneously around the Cleveland Browns and the players connected to that organization, and they look different on the surface, but they're asking the same underlying question. In the Sorsby situation, you have a player who met the written criteria, worked with a celebrated legal team, submitted exactly what was asked of him, and got rejected on standards that don't exist in the actual agreement. In the Sanders situation, you have a quarterback competition where the surface-level narrative and the internal reality may be running in different directions, shaped by forces that aren't being officially acknowledged, and that the player most exposed to them has very limited ability to address publicly. In both cases, the powerful party is pushing a version of events, and the messy, more complicated truth is operating underneath it. What I keep returning to is the question of what happens when these situations get pushed far enough that the truth underneath becomes unavoidable. The Sorsby case could produce a legal precedent that changes how the supplemental draft operates for years, forcing the NFL to either apply its written standards consistently or defend in court exactly why it chose not to in this specific instance. The quarterback battle in Cleveland is going to produce real game footage eventually, and game footage has a way of cutting through narratives in ways that internal leaks simply can't. You can shape the story coming out of a closed practice. You cannot shape the story when the plays are being broadcast to millions of people in real time. Both of these situations are early. Both of them are going to develop in ways that aren't fully predictable right now. But what I'm confident about is that they're going to tell us something meaningful, not just about the specific people involved, but about how this league actually operates when the institutional version of events gets challenged by someone willing to push back with real force. That's the part I find most worth watching, because that's the part that actually matters beyond the individual outcomes.